while we're getting this going, let me at least begin the introduction. It's really my great personal, there we go, thank you, pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Karen DeYoung. Karen is really an extraordinary journalist. She's had quite a remarkable career in the field of international and national security reporting, in which is becoming harder and harder to find these days. Somebody who's actually spent a considerable part of her career actually out in the field covering international affairs from where it's happening, as well as from Washington, where it always seems to be happening. She's currently the associate editor of the Washington Post and the senior diplomatic correspondent covering the Bush administration's foreign policy. But over her career, she's held a number of positions, including assisting managing editor for National News, foreign editor, and bureau chief in Latin America and London, actually where I first came to know Karen well when I was a fellow at the Institute for Strategic Studies. She's reported from Africa and from the Middle East, and really has had an extraordinary set of experiences that have seen American foreign policy through all its twists and turns over the last 30-plus years. She took some time off from the Post to write this biography of Secretary Powell, and it really was, I think, very insightful and prescient of her to find the time to do this, because while there's been a certain amount of reporting, and we certainly had Secretary Powell's own autobiography, there really has not been an in-depth examination of his career, particularly not so much as a soldier as a diplomat and a strategist for the United States. And so as we debate and examine the whole question about U.S. national strategy, understanding both Powell's career and his involvement in the decision-making over the last several years is particularly timely and will be very informative to the debates as we go into the next election cycle. Karen, as I say, has had posts all over the world. She's been joined in that by another very distinguished journalist, her husband, who works for the Canadian Broadcast Company and is now still the bureau chief, yes? Yes, in Washington for the CBC. I think rather than take any more of this valuable time, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Karen DeYoung. Watch the chords.
Right, you watch the chords. Thank you, Jim. And thank you all for having me. It's such a great pleasure to come here. I actually was supposed to come yesterday to spend some time with Jim and his wife, who are old friends, but there was a blizzard in Washington, a rare occurrence in these days of global warming or whatever it is. So I'm very happy to be here because it's warm and because I get a chance to talk about Colin Powell, one of my favorite subjects. I have to say that writing a biography about somebody who's still alive, and especially somebody who remains active in public life, is hard. There's always one main original source who can tell you you don't know what you're talking about, and it's also kind of a moving target. He's still doing things, and I try every once in a while to go through Nexus for clippings to see what Powell's been up to, and he remains very active. He speaks around the world for exorbitant, in my view, amounts of money. He appears on TV, and he's also evoked over and over again by people not only in Washington but around the world as the voice of wisdom and integrity. Last month, Senator Kennedy was giving a speech on the Senate floor and asked about Iraq, are we really being more loyal to our troops, putting them in the midst of a civil war? That's the way our generals understand it, and Colin Powell has described it that way. The other day there was an announcement for a big industry conference in March at which Powell is going to be the keynote speaker, and it described him as someone who will share his views on what it takes to be a true leader and his strategies for taking charge during times of great change and crisis. A lot of people who are angry about the war in Iraq write letters to our newspaper and to others around the country and frequently mention Powell. There was a letter the other day to the editor of the Sacramento Bee accusing President Bush of cherry-picking intelligence information to create a false justification for his predetermined decision to invade Iraq. He then compromised Colin Powell's integrity by having him present misleading information to the United Nations. Powell himself, you might have seen in December, was on Face the Nation, where he publicly questioned the wisdom of a military buildup in Iraq, a new military buildup, and noted that the active army itself is just about broken. And finally, I recall about a month or so ago, and I was riding the exercise bicycle in the gym, kind of staring at a television talk show in which panelists were discussing what they called the dream ticket for the 2008 elections of Barack Obama and Colin Powell. They didn't say which one would be the president. What I find really fascinating about this is that it's almost as if it all didn't happen, as if Colin Powell had never been George Bush's Secretary of State, as if he hadn't been the person who, on February 5th, 2005, in a speech to the United Nations, single-handedly turned public opinion in favor of an invasion of Iraq by telling the American people, who hadn't believed it from the president or the vice president, that we were in urgent danger from Saddam Hussein. There's certainly a lot of people who still hold Powell responsible for that. I hear it as I travel around the country and talk about the book. I hear it in call-in shows on radios, in television talk shows. But as we struggle through this terrible war, I'm still amazed by Powell's recuperative powers. It's almost as if he's reverted back to the time when he had just retired from the military, when he was Colin Powell, the hero, and the most admired and trusted man in America. I'm not really here to criticize him and say he doesn't deserve it, but after spending almost 3 years of my own life immersed in his, I've come to some conclusions about him. On balance, I think he's a man who performed remarkable service to his country. In a different administration, perhaps at a different time, I think he might have been a great Secretary of State. But unfortunately for him, and I think for the country, there was a kind of negative serendipity, if I can use that term, that brought him and George W. Bush together. And instead of bringing out the great strengths of Powell's experience, of his talent for leadership and his wisdom, it preyed upon his weaknesses. Powell's a man of great courage, decency, rectitude, humor, charm. He is, in fact, a leader of men, and I think anyone who's served under him in the military or worked with him at the State Department will tell you that. He's also a man of great ambition, that often manifests itself with great caution. He's a man of institutions, who sometimes let his respect for institutions overcome his belief in what is right. He can be calculating, and he can be conniving, like all good politicians. He's a man of extreme self-awareness and a masterful ability to shape his own image before the media and the public. Yet he seems strangely unable to do so within the Bush administration, and almost willfully unaware of what was happening to him. I had been working, as Jim said, covering the Bush administration's foreign policy for 2 years when I started writing about Powell. By that time, it was clear that everything those of us in daily journalism had written about him being the odd man out, about the arguments and the ideological schisms within the Bush administration, were all true. Always a gratifying realization for a journalist. Even before it was clear that key elements of his UN speech were based on false evidence, and he was left with a large part of the responsibility for the Iraq War, the question was, how come he didn't resign? Why had he taken the massive amount of capital he had amassed in public credibility and respect and handed it all over to George Bush to spend? It was clear that much of his advice on major foreign policy issues was ignored. He was repeatedly humiliated. Even his foreign minister colleagues, many of whom I talked to when I was researching the book, had begun to wonder if they could believe what he told them about administration policy. They knew they had to check it with the White House first. In the course of researching the book, I interviewed Powell 5 times in his office at the State Department. If any of you have been there, it's on the 7th floor of the 8th floor building. It's filled with early American heirloom furniture and thick carpets, and it's quite impressive. The entryway to the inner sanctum of the Secretary of State is a large reception room filled with priceless 18th century American antiques. But the Secretary's office itself is surprisingly small and unassuming, especially when you compare it to the offices of other cabinet secretaries, like the Defense Secretary, who has a huge office. The Interior Secretary has a wonderful office overlooking the Potomac River. Even the Secretary of State's deputy and undersecretaries had far larger offices than the Secretary himself. Except for the desk and some period armchairs, it was furnished, at least when Powell was there, with the same dark leather sofas that you see all over the world in American embassies. The windows were small and covered with thick curtains. Powell had a small little table lamp on his desk, and the place was kind of womb-like. Near the door, there were the paintings of his two heroes, Thomas Jefferson and George Marshall. He had family pictures on the bookshelves and some of the mementos he carried all over the world with him from his military career. Computer was always on. Powell's something of a computer geek, and he's kind of a demon at emails and BlackBerries, and he answers pretty promptly, much to my advantage, and to the great circle of friends and military colleagues that he still maintains. The last time I interviewed him for the book, however, was in the spring of 2005, after he'd left the State Department and moved to an office across the Potomac River in Alexandria, Virginia. It was the top floor of a building that houses America's Promise, the volunteer organization to help disadvantaged youth that he had founded nearly 10 years earlier when he left the Army. That office is opulent by comparison to his cubbyhole at the State Department. It was far larger, huge picture windows looking over the river, Washington Monument, and the Capitol in the distance. Everything was there. His paintings of the Buffalo Soldiers, his little pen and pencil set that he won in 1957 for being the best cadet in his ROTC summer camp class. But the office itself seemed very sterile and silent, and Powell himself seemed very nervous and wary. He spent a few awkward minutes trying to get his little Sony tape recorder to work so he could tape our conversation, and when he couldn't figure it out, he tossed it down on the desk, and I told him I'd send him a copy of my transcript. We talked a little bit about what he was up to. He said he wasn't planning on writing a book. He said he'd told all his good stories in his own autobiography, which came out in 1995. Some of you may have read it. It's kind of a series of anecdotes about his youth and his Army career. It's actually very good. He said nobody wanted to read about the day-to-day life of a government official. He certainly wasn't going to tell tales about the Bush administration. He was clearly very irritated at the rash of news analyses of his just-ended tenure, most of which either sharply criticized him as someone who had failed to live up to his potential as Secretary of State and had willingly helped the administration head into what had turned out to be a disastrous war, or speculated that he must be distraught over the way things had turned out for him. "Why am I distraught?" he asked testily. "We're working on our relationships. Look what we've done with Russia, China, NATO, and the EU. Remember, this administration came in saying, we've got to get out of Bosnia. And it was Colin Powell who went in there and said, we went in together, we come out together. It took 3 months before the president could say it, but I staunched that wound until he could heal it. That's what we've done. Afghanistan? I'm the one who got the Pakistanis to go along with it. Everybody hated the roadmap for the Middle East. Nobody would even use those words. Now it's flavor of the month. Six-party framework on North Korea, EU initiative on Iran. I was the one that said, let's go work with these guys. And now we're having meetings to see how we can move those processes along. He had fought to send U.S. troops to Liberia and an international force to Haiti, he said. He had fought for and won the largest increase in U.S. foreign assistance since the Marshall Plan. And he'd focused the administration attention and resources on the global HIV/AIDS problem. One of the things he was most proud of was that he'd restored the workforce and the budget and the morale of the State Department. But what was interesting about this, what amounted to a tirade, was that he had placed all of his accomplishments in the context of battles he had fought within the administration itself. Many of the things he'd cited as victories had been in fact compromised by the very struggles it had taken to win them. Today, the administration's policies on the Middle East and North Korea are more or less where Powell advocated they start in 2001, diplomatic talks with Pyongyang, and a deeper and more realistic U.S. involvement in the Arab-Israeli peace process. But clearly much was lost in the process. And in this long outpouring, the most surprising thing was that Powell never mentioned Iraq, the issue that overshadowed everything else about the Bush administration's foreign policy, and the one on which much of his legacy as Secretary of State would be based. History's judgment was unlikely to be kind. My interviews with Powell were clearly important in understanding him, but equally, if not more important, was the standard work of contemporary biography, researching his past as well as his present. It took me through more than 100 interviews with friends of his from his childhood and his military career and his work in government, friends and colleagues in the Army, through the 5 administrations in which he served, in the current White House, the State and Defense Departments, the intelligence community, and foreign diplomats. I visited a half-dozen presidential libraries, spent a lot of hours in the National Archives trolling through unit records for his 2 tours in Vietnam, and through his own personal papers at the National Defense University. But I started in Jamaica, the small island where his parents had come from in the early 1920s. He has lots of cousins there, lots of relatives, an extended and still remarkably close family. In southwestern Jamaica, the tiny tin-roofed house where his father and his 8 siblings were raised, his father's 8 siblings were raised, is still standing. His parents were trailblazers when they separately left the island in the early 1920s for New York City. And what I discovered not only there, but as I talked to members of his family and people who had known him in his younger days, is that his Jamaican heritage is key to understanding Colin Powell. It informs literally everything he is and does. Like most immigrant communities, West Indians in New York City, in Powell's case, where most of them were, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, stuck together. Although they'd come from black majority islands, where they largely ran their own affairs, in this country they became a minority within a minority. They were disdainful of American blacks, who seemed to them to have accepted the racism that pervaded this country and the social and economic limitations it placed on their lives. For the most part, they simply failed to acknowledge it. They stuck to themselves and together with other immigrant groups, Jews, Italians, Greeks, determined to seize what this country had to offer and not to be refused. American blacks didn't like them either. They found the West Indian immigrants uppity, arrogant, and unsympathetic toward the history that they had endured here. It would be wrong to say, I think, that Powell was unaware of racism growing up first in Harlem and then in the Bronx, but it was a very small part of his life by the time he enrolled in City College in New York and joined the ROTC there. And he was determined that whatever successes he achieved and failures he endured would be part of his own actions and abilities. His entry into the Army was serendipitous, and here I use it in its good sense. It had been 10 years since President Truman had ordered the military to desegregate, and only 4 years since the last all-black unit in the Army had broken up. The Army was under pressure to at least make a showing of promoting black officers, and they found in Powell a man who, unlike most of the blacks who were in the military at that time, was comfortable around whites, who talked like them, and didn't come with the baggage of perceived second-class citizenship. Powell's 2 tours in Vietnam were marked by heroism and a growing belief that this nation's military brass walked hand in hand into disaster with its political leaders. And those were views that would inform his thinking many years later. As a mid-level officer, he rose quickly, his competence undeniably enhanced by his color. As a senior staff aide to several secretaries of defense, he had a front-row seat to military and civilian policymaking and began to develop his own views about leadership, the proper role of the military, and the use of force. In 1987, Powell became Ronald Reagan's last national security advisor. He had 6. And he was ready to take the national stage. It was there that his military formation was first brought to bear on civilian policymaking, and his calm competence and unquestionable integrity put Reagan's tumultuous presidency back on track after the Iran-Contra debacle and helped to prepare the nation for the end of the Cold War. Powell's chairmanship of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President Bush, I think, was his finest hour. His views of foreign policy had solidified into qualities that later came to be disdained: pragmatism, compassion, realism, multilateralism, a view of the United States as both a world leader and a member of the community of nations. Excuse me, I have a drink of water. By the fall of 1995, 2 years after he'd left the military after 35 years in the Army, Colin Powell was the most trusted and respected person in America. Worldwide, in poll after poll, he was right up there with Mahatma Gandhi and often just under Jesus Christ. He was the hero of the Persian Gulf War, the black man held in high esteem by all races. His autobiography sold 1 million copies within weeks after it was released. His very existence made Americans feel good about themselves and about their country. I think it's hard to imagine with the kind of political polarization we have today, but Powell seemed to transcend party politics. A year before the 1996 presidential election, virtually every newspaper and magazine in this country had him on their cover amid rampant speculation that he would run. Some Democrats wanted Bill Clinton to replace Al Gore with Powell as his vice presidential running mate. He'd already turned down 2 offers to be Clinton's Secretary of State. Republican polls and even the internal polling in the Democratic White House indicated that if Powell ran as a Republican, he was the only person who very possibly might beat Clinton in 1996. Clinton himself believed that he would never serve a second term if Powell ran against him. Like a lot of military men, Powell took great pride in not belonging to a political party. He'd voted for Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, but also for John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Jimmy Carter, at least the first time Jimmy Carter ran. I think whether most Americans would have pulled the lever for a black man in the privacy of the voting booth will remain a mystery, at least a mystery until we see if Barack Obama is nominated this time. But at the time, a majority of Americans of all colors in both political parties told pollsters that their votes were his for the asking. I don't think there's any question that Powell wanted to be president. Despite the fears of his family and the negative advice of virtually all of his friends, he wrote an announcement speech declaring his candidacy. He had decided to run, he would tell them, because he knew the American people wanted change. They wanted a government that was both smaller and most responsive to their needs. He described himself as a classic moderate and multilateralist, strong defense, conservative fiscal policy, and liberal social views. He supported affirmative action and a woman's right to choose. Interestingly, when I found a copy of that speech, or actually someone gave it to me, my publisher told me that I couldn't quote from it in any detail without his permission because it technically belonged to him and he held the copyright to it. And it was the one thing, the one document that I had from his life that he refused to let me quote from. And so I ended up having to paraphrase it. It was a very good speech. But the same polls that showed that Powell stood a good chance of winning the general election indicated that he would have a lot of trouble winning the nomination for either the Republicans or the Democrats. State primaries, then as now, were run by party activists. Indications were, of course, that the Democrats were going to stick with Clinton, and the Republican Party seemed to be Powell's only option. Yet the Republicans at the time, and remember this was just after the 94 midterm elections that brought Newt Gingrich and the Contract for America into being, were in the hammerlock of conservatives who were dead set against Powell. Winning the nomination would require months of political pandering, in his view, asking for money, something he found repugnant, and compromising. Again, I think he certainly wanted to be president, but the idea of running for office was repugnant. There was also the possibility that Republican activists, even knowing that he was the only candidate who stood any chance of beating Clinton, would fight tooth and nail to defeat him in the primaries. And at the last minute, he pulled back. He held a press conference in November of 1995 in which he announced he was withdrawing from the race. But to the amazement of many of his friends, and certainly of his family, almost all of whom are Democrats and registered independents, he declared himself a Republican anyway. He said he was going to register with the party and left himself open for the 2000 elections. He said he was going to spend the next 4 years pulling the party back from what he saw as its headlong rush to the right, bringing it back to where he thought it should be, in the middle. But less than 2 years later, in 1997, he announced that he would not be running for president in 2000. And he very quickly lost interest in politics, and in fact didn't participate at all in the Republican Party during those 4 years. And by the time the election approached, the nomination went to George W. Bush, and Powell quickly joined his team as Secretary of State. At the time, it was hailed as a stroke of political genius by Bush. A lot of people were nervous that the Texas governor was ignorant of foreign affairs and would be a tool of the party's right wing. Powell really wanted the job, one that he thought would be perfect for the skills and knowledge he had spent his career honing, and one that required, in his view, no political pandering. Yet 4 years later, as Bush was reelected, Powell was jettisoned. He was fired without so much as a thank you or a handshake from the president. The end was an inelegant phone call from the White House Chief of Staff, Andy Card, a week after the election. The president wants to make a change, Card told him, and they expected Powell's resignation letter within 2 days. Powell went home and typed it himself. The White House found a typo in it and later sent it back and asked him to do it again. The following Monday, his resignation was announced, along with the name of his successor, Bush's National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice. After the release of his resignation letter, Powell saw Bush over the next 2 months in the regular course of business. He was in the Oval Office a lot for routine meetings that took place as if nothing had happened. Bush never spoke to him about his departure. Eventually, the White House contacted his office to describe what they called a farewell call with the president. The same calls were being set up for all departing cabinet secretaries. The meeting was scheduled for January 13th, and as it approached, the White House called Powell's office with a request for talking points that the president's aide could use to brief him about the conversation. It was the final indignity, I think, the president who needed notes to talk to his most senior cabinet officer after 4 years. The appointed time of the meeting arrived, and Powell was already in the Oval Office that morning for a session on something else. When that session was over, everyone left and Powell lingered behind. Bush seemed sort of puzzled and called after Andy Card, who was also leaving the room. "Where you going, Andy?" Powell cleared his throat and said, "Mr. President, I think this is supposed to be our farewell call." "Is that why Condi ain't here?" the president said. "Yeah, that was probably the reason," Powell said, since she had been there for every meeting they'd had previously over 4 years. Card walked back inside and the three men sat down. Powell already decided finally to use the opportunity, which was likely his last as Secretary of State, to unload. The war in Iraq was going south, he told the president, and there was little time left to turn it around. Remember, this was in January of 2005. The administration's hope at the time was that the upcoming election in Iraq would change the dynamics on the ground, that the Iraqi people would finally be ready and able to begin standing up to the growing insurgency on their own. But the administration, Powell pointed out, had entertained such hopes before over the past 2 years, when they'd set up a new legal framework in Iraq, when they'd first turned over a modicum of government power to hand-picked Iraqis, and when Saddam Hussein had been captured. These hopes had been dashed every time. Powell told Bush that there would be a window of about 2 months to start to see progress after the Iraqi elections. If by the 1st of April this insurgency is not starting to ameliorate in some way, then I think you have a problem, he said. Elections and talking about democracy were not going to stop the insurgency. Only the Iraqi army could do that, and it was unclear whether it would ever succeed. Its competence was not just a matter of training, Powell said. It was a question of whether the troops actually believed in what they were fighting for. He then went on to warn Bush about serious problems within his own administration, saying that the power Bush had given the Pentagon to meddle in diplomacy on issues as widespread as North Korea, Iraq, and the Arab-Israeli conflict, along with poisoned personal relations between his state and defense departments, were seriously undermining the president's diplomacy. Bush waved him off. Wasn't any worse, he said, than the legendary battles between state and defense during the Reagan administration. At the end of the session, they finally shook hands, and Powell went back to the State Department. It was really strange, he said to his chief of staff, Larry Wilkerson. The president didn't seem to know why I was there. As he left office, a lot of Americans felt that Powell had betrayed them and betrayed the country, that he'd lent his prestige and his reputation to an unworthy administration and an ignoble cause in Iraq. Others thought he'd been duped by the Bush administration, that he was the one who had been betrayed. He'd been used to build support for the conflict on the basis of evidence he didn't know was false and then was discarded. Still others, primarily on the far right of the Republican Party, said good riddance to Powell. Some saw his doubts about the war as disloyalty and blamed him for what went wrong in Iraq. I think part of the answer for why he didn't resign, why he stayed on, is the obvious one. You can see it from the title of my book. He was a soldier. He'd gotten where he was by obeying orders. He was a man who was used to working within institutions, not outside of them. But I think there are other reasons. Powell's career had never given him any experience with failure. He simply never grasped the extent of his isolation. He wanted to continue being Secretary of State. He agreed with most of his staff that his departure would remove the last remaining impediment to policies he was convinced would be even worse if he weren't there. At the same time, his own pride prevented him from seeing reality. He equated even thinking about resignation with defeat. And while others may have seen him as defeated, he refused to admit it to himself. I think Powell knows that people are waiting for him to vent his spleen on those 4 years, but I don't think he'll ever do it. He did it a bit in his interviews with me, but I think those interviews were a relatively small part of my research for the book. And for every anguished and angry comment from him, there were a lot of others who felt he'd let the country down and emerged a lesser man, someone who had the chance to change the course of history and chose not to take it. Thank you. You don't have to get up.
Do the questions again, but I'm going to abuse the privilege of the host
Okay.
and ask the first one.
Okay.
I'd like you to touch on something you didn't talk a lot about in your talk, which is Powell's conception of the role of Secretary of State, and in particular with respect to the Middle East. I mean, it is, if you look back over the last generation, the place most distinctively that Secretary of States have made their mark, they've seen this the place, they're going to be actively and personally involved. Kissinger and et al. As you know, I spent a lot of time with Secretary Christopher in the Middle East. Powell never grabbed it, had that fateful trip in April 2002 to the Middle East. So I'd like you to specifically talk about the Middle East in the context more of how he understood his role as the nation's chief diplomat.
It's so painful to watch. When they came in, their first national security meeting was about the Middle East. And I think that Powell and his second, who he brought with him, were both quite impressed that Bush did not seem to have strong opinions about it one way or another. that he said that obviously Clinton had gone right up to the end, as you well know, trying to get a deal, was unable to do so for all the reasons that we're familiar with. I think that Bush, on the one hand, was clearly very reluctant to continue along with what he saw as Clinton's policy, but also, again, didn't have clear opinions about the Middle East. He said he wanted to size up then Prime Minister, was it Sharon? Yeah, Sharon. And also Yasser Arafat, didn't say anything bad about him. Powell made the point that they ought to, that this was the highest priority for the administration, and they ought to get working on it right away. But there was not a lot of interest among his colleagues among the principals, and certainly with the president, and certainly not with the National Security Advisor. He made a trip very early on in 2001, which was viewed as fairly successful. Went and saw everybody, came back again, said we need to get moving on this. Made very little progress until just before the beginning of September of 2001, when there actually was some thought that the president was going to meet with Yasser Arafat at the General Assembly session that fall. Powell went off on a trip to South America, and while he was there, the 9/11 attacks happened. After that, there was no chance that the president was going to meet with Yasser Arafat, and there was no interest really in pursuing a deal in the Middle East. I think you're right that Powell himself did not engage in very aggressive diplomacy, and there were several reasons for that. One, there was, as I said, no interest at that time within the administration of pursuing it, although he did manage in November of that year to give a big speech which outlined a couple of policy initiatives. That's when he sent General Zinni to the Middle East to try to get some kind of accommodations going. Remember, that was the time of the Tenet Agreement, the security agreements, where we were going to build up a security force on the West Bank that could overcome terrorists on the West Bank. But I think the diversion of attention in the White House, the lack of interest at that point by the president, the vice president, certainly the defense secretary, who argued over and over again that Bush should not spend his political capital on this, and also an abiding, growing feeling on Powell's behalf that he shouldn't leave town. That if he left town, something terrible would happen, and in fact it did many times. And I go through these things in the book and can give you some examples if you want them. What happened was in the spring of '02, as the United States, the White House was starting to think about invading Iraq and wanted support from Arab governments in the region, they concluded finally that they couldn't do that unless they did something about the Arab-Israeli situation, that the Arab governments, for their own reasons, were not going to be amenable. As it turned out, they weren't very amenable anyway, but that they were not even going to entertain the subject unless there was some progress made. And so it was decided that Powell should go on another trip to the Middle East. This was in the April of '02. But at the same time he was sent off, he was not given any tools. There was some talk that he was going to achieve a ceasefire, that he was going to start negotiations again, that he was going to invite the leaders of both sides to Washington, all of which he was specifically prohibited from doing by the White House. And so as he went there, he was kind of hung out to dry. And I think he felt himself powerless to do anything about it. And again, I think this is part of his weakness, if you will. The whole time he was gone, he was constantly on the phone to Rice, who was calling up saying, don't say this, don't say that, you're not authorized to do this, you're not authorized to do that. And by the time he came home, I think he had basically just abandoned any hope of doing anything in the region, and also was as obsessed with everyone else, although somewhat on the opposite side of the fence, although not completely, with what was going on in Iraq. or what was about to go on in Iraq. His attention shifted in the fall of that year to the UN, and then the invasion in Iraq happened, and that became the sort of be-all and end-all of his activities. So I think that it's interesting. He had gotten, his first week as Secretary of State, he'd gotten a letter from George Kennan, who basically said, don't ever leave town. Although for different reasons. He said, your job is, you are the president's primary foreign policy advisor. And we have ambassadors who can do things overseas. Your job is to give the president advice and make sure the president does the right thing. And that's certainly how Powell saw himself. He came in with, if you look at the speech he gave when he was announced as the Secretary of State nominee, if you look at his confirmation testimony, it really does present a fairly broad, kind of pragmatic, multilateralist worldview. And that's what Powell thought he was going to promote. Unfortunately, there were people in the government who, while George Bush didn't have very strong feelings about foreign policy, there were other people who had very strong feelings about it. The Vice President, the Defense Secretary, and Powell was outnumbered and never found a way around it. He had no relationship with Bush, no personal relationship with Bush. He had no private meetings ever with Bush. I think until he had a dinner with Bush right before the inauguration, and I don't think he had another private meeting with him until after he was out of office. And he simply never found a way to promote his own views. I mean, I don't think he had an ideological view of the Middle East, or even a sense of what was right or wrong. Powell is fairly dispassionate about foreign policy, and felt that it was what the Arabs were telling them about how, look, you're not going to be able to solve anything else until you solve this, simply made sense. But he was unable to push that view or any other views, really, on the administration. Sir?
Well, would you mind commenting about the schism or the conflict between Rumsfeld and Powell, and how much that marginalized him, and also maybe how Cheney played into it, and what was the relationship between Powell and Condoleezza Rice?
Powell certainly knew all of those people. Obviously, he had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs when Cheney was Defense Secretary, and I think they had while certainly not a close relationship, by and large a mutually beneficial relationship. Cheney came in not knowing that much about the kind of nuts and bolts of the defense establishment, and Powell saw it to his own advantage to make Cheney look good, and actually set up these little classes for for Cheney as they approached the Gulf War in January of '91. Cheney was often very exasperated with Powell because, as I said, I really think it was sort of Powell's finest hour when he was chairman. It was really the only time that he was, I think, an actual strategic thinker, where he thought about how to get from point A to point M as opposed to A to B, which is what he spent most of his time doing, certainly as Secretary of State. I think that, as I say, I think Cheney resented him a lot because he was enormously popular, because he came to symbolize the Gulf War, and then was practically begged to run for president, while Cheney's own presidential campaign at that time, if you recall, sort of fizzled because he couldn't get anybody to give him any money. Powell basically didn't know Rumsfeld, except kind of in passing. Condoleezza Rice he had known in the Bush White House, considered her far younger, far less experienced, kind of a nice person. She had come from Birmingham, where Powell's wife had come from, and there were various interrelationships between their families. And so after, when Clinton came into office, Rice would come to Washington every once in a while, and she would go to dinner at their house, and they stayed in contact. I think he was perfectly happy when she became National Security Advisor. basically because he thought he would be running foreign policy and she wouldn't get in his way. During the campaign, when Cheney and Rice certainly were together, and Rumsfeld was on the periphery basically working on missile defense, no one asked Powell's advice. Powell was not consulted by the campaign. In fact, the campaign wanted to stay away from him, although Bush frequently referred to Powell as one of his advisors. He wasn't an advisor at all. The political people around Bush did not want Powell around, although they, again, wanted to say, for those who were nervous that Bush was going to be too extreme or didn't know about foreign policy, it became convenient to say that Powell was with them, and he certainly was with them because he wanted to be Secretary of State. But there was no consultation. There were no conversations. The campaign thought that Powell would outshine Bush on the campaign trail, and they didn't want him with them. And also, you had Cheney and Rumsfeld, who had been out of power for many years and had spent that time really thinking about what kind of foreign policy they wanted, whereas Powell hadn't. Powell just thought it was axiomatic that, of course, he would be the best candidate for Secretary of State. Who else? That he'd spent his life leading up to that moment. And so they came in, Powell thinking that he was going to run foreign policy, Cheney and Rumsfeld having very definite ideas about foreign policy and how they were going to run it, and Condoleezza Rice basically turning out to be an extremely weak national security advisor who, in Powell's view, certainly totally failed at the job. It was a job that he had had himself, and he had very definite ideas about how it was supposed to work and what the role of the national security advisor was supposed to be. And in his view, Rice didn't fulfill any of those roles. She basically told Bush what he wanted to hear, did not inform the president that there were opposing views, and allowed certainly Rumsfeld to have access in ways that Powell was not only not given but wasn't even informed of. In his view, also the chairman, who was General Myers during most of that time, was a complete cipher. Powell had felt that he had a very definite political role when he was chairman, and he'd studied the Goldwater-Nichols Act from '86, the Defense Reorganization Act, very carefully, and the authorities that it gave him, and he used them and pushed it as far as he could. He went to all the principals' meetings. He felt like he had an independent vote. Myers never felt that way. He never deviated from what Rumsfeld said. And so Powell was completely outnumbered any time they ever debated anything, which was rare. And he also, again, did not have a personal relationship with the president, certainly the way Cheney did, and the way Rumsfeld eventually did. I think that personally, Powell always thought that Cheney was kind of a right-wing nut, although he thought he was quite smart. He thought that Rumsfeld was a terrible defense secretary. He was very disdainful, the way I think most career military people were, of all this talk about transformation. He felt like the Army in particular was always transforming itself, that it expanded and contracted and changed its orientation depending on the threat at the time. And he was very disdainful of the whole crowd. And I think that that worked against him because he didn't engage, much to the fury of many people who worked for him in the State Department, who thought that he didn't get it, that he, his view was, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing, and because I'm right, eventually I'll win. And he just never did. Yes?
I found your remarks really very interesting, but I was struck by your comments actually in response to the earlier question that Secretary Powell viewed his role as Secretary of State as primarily the dominant top foreign policy advisor. Because up to that point, I was sort of checking off all the boxes for his view, in the way you were describing him as being the lead implementer of foreign policy, do whatever you're told, let yourself be run, hamstrung by phone calls from Washington constantly while you're in the Middle East, all of these different things, downplaying his feeling that he was supposed to act as an advisor. And I connect the dots one step further. the comparison to when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs and claiming a role as military advisor. He knew what to do when the Clinton administration wasn't paying attention sufficiently to what he thought they ought to do. And there was this famous incident of the New York Times op-ed that he wrote about intervention in former Yugoslavia, where lots of people thought this was a crisis of civil-military relations because, gee, he should be an implementer, not going to the public with his own view of when it's appropriate to intervene, and people thought he should be fired for this. There were a whole set of things. Yet he never did anything to take steps to bolster his role as advisor. This is his vision of the job. Where was the New York Times op-ed, equivalent of the Washington Post op-ed, not criticizing the policy, but just saying this is what the policy should be, or we all know that this is what the policy really is, or whatever it is that he would have had to write.
I think that the first 8 months of the Bush administration was a very rude awakening for Powell, even before 9/11. You'll remember that the first thing that happened was the South Korean president was coming to visit Bush in March of '01, and Powell was asked the day before, so, what's our policy on North Korea? And he said, well, our policy is we're basically continuing what the Clinton administration did, try to talk to them, continuing the agreed framework, a lot of good things left on the table. The next day, when it came out in the papers, Powell got a phone call at 7 in the morning from Condoleezza Rice saying, that's not our policy, what are you talking about? That morning, as Bush met with the South Korean president, Powell was in the Oval Office with them and literally got sent out during the meeting to the reporters who were standing outside waiting for the meeting to be over to say, oh, I know some of you must have gotten the wrong impression yesterday that we said, we haven't decided our policy on North Korea yet. We're still reviewing that. And anybody who thought that just got the wrong idea, even though he himself had said it. And people inside the State Department were appalled. I mean, to them, this was, it's like to the woodshed. And very quickly after that came the Kyoto incident, where Powell was sitting in his office one morning, gets a phone call from Rice saying, I'm going to fax you over this letter. I guess they sent it by email then. Send you this copy of this letter that the Vice President has put together to respond to congressional inquiries from some Republican senators who want to know what the President's going to do about Kyoto, even though Bush had said in his campaign that he was for caps on carbon emissions and all kinds of things. And the senators had written in and said, what are you talking about? How can you be for that? And what are you going to do about Kyoto? Sends a letter over to Powell. And it basically said, we're against it. We're not going to do any of this stuff. Don't worry about it. And Powell, called her back and said, well, you can't do that. Not because of the policy, because he didn't feel he should be involved in environmental policy, but because it didn't say anything about we're going to consult with our allies. We're going to take this step by step. We're going to, move in an organized way. And he sent it back, and she called and said, well, never mind, they don't like your corrections. And he said, well, don't do anything, I'm coming over there right now. Goes out, jumps in his car, goes to the White House, gets there in 10 minutes, and they say, oh, sorry, Cheney already left. He walked the letter himself up to Capitol Hill. Again, lots of negative press, lots of what's going on. And so he had this really bad time trying to find his way, where when he did speak out, he was slapped down pretty much every time. And I think that, as I said, by September of '01, you'll remember Rumsfeld was also being criticized at that time. He'd gotten raked over the coals by Congress over the defense budget. It was clear that people in the Pentagon didn't like him. And so Powell, having spent this terrible summer, was starting to say, oh, well, now things are turning around my way. And then came 9/11. And, everybody always says 9/11 changed everything. It certainly changed everything for Powell. And I think at that moment, any chance that he was going to be what he himself envisioned as Secretary of State was lost. Why didn't he speak out? Because I think that as policy came to be focused more and more and more on counterterrorism, he didn't see any room to do that. I think it was a mistake. Certainly many people who worked with him thought it was a mistake. But I think that's where the other point that's important to make is that when Powell was chairman, he had many, many allies. He had allies on Capitol Hill. He had, to some extent, an ally in Jim Baker. He had other people, senior people in the administration, who basically agreed with him, certainly in the Bush administration. And yet he had no allies at all. He had nobody. There was nobody else in the cabinet. There was nobody in the White House. There was certainly no one with power on Capitol Hill who was going to support him. And it was very clear that he was going to be completely on his own. I mean, the Clinton administration, I think that was kind of a no-brainer for him, because he clearly felt himself, he was very much aware of his public image and the power that he had at that point, and I think felt much freer to kind of run a little bit roughshod over the Clinton administration in those early days. Yes?
Just hypothetically, if he had been appointed Secretary of State, would he have had more influence in the administration? I'm wondering, I mean,
Secretary of Defense?
Secretary of Defense. I'm wondering, once he lost that mantle of the warrior, did that sort of take away who he was a little bit, or and also would he have wanted to be Secretary of Defense at all?
Well, if you remember what happened at that time, remember Cheney was in charge of Bush's transition team, and Powell was the first cabinet appointment. And Powell wanted to be Secretary of State. He didn't want to be Secretary. He wanted to be Secretary of State. And he and Rich Armitage, who was his friend and had been part of the Bush advisory team during the campaign, had very definite ideas on who should be Secretary of Defense. And there was a lot of commentary at the time, certainly in conservative circles, where people really didn't like Powell, that said, you know, oh my God, Powell's going to be Secretary of State, and we know, you know, he's tight with the Pentagon, and now he's going to run everything, and so we better get somebody who can stand up to him. And I think that's directly the reason why Cheney went to Rumsfeld and asked him to be Defense Secretary, specifically to provide a block to Powell and Powell's influence. As I say, I think Powell thought, Powell was very full of himself at that time, and Powell thought that being Secretary of State was the next logical step for him. He'd done the military thing, and that he was going to move on to the larger world of foreign policy using the experience that he had, because he thought of himself as a foreign policy maker as he left the chairmanship, I think.
Can we take one more?
Sir.
Yes, was there any discussion about his involvement in the investigation of the My massacre? A lot of people say that he was actually initially complicit in the cover-up that didn't come to light until 2 young enlisted men went outside of the chain of command and wrote letters. And also on his relationship, perception by the black community, in particular the Caribbean community, because Harry Belafonte doesn't like him, actually called him a house nigger. And I was actually in the military 20 years ago, and I was one of his troops, and when we sent troops to Haiti, when we sent troops to Grenada, when we sent troops to Panama, and certainly Somalia, there was a lot of tension between the races within the ranks. So I'm guessing that for a man at his stature within the ranks, he must have dealt with something.
Well, it's important to say that Grenada was in 1983 when he was not in a policy-making position, and he actually opposed sending troops to Somalia when he was chairman. But in terms of My Lai, yeah, there's a long, long part in the book about that, and I won't bore you about it. I think that's kind of a bum rap. I think that he was a fairly junior guy at the time. You know, there was one letter that was sent before the Ridenour letter that was sent to Congress and sort of broke the whole thing open. Powell was one of many, many junior officers to whom a memo was circulated saying, look, we got this letter from this guy, what do we say? And the guy kind of outlined a lot of atrocities without any specifics, basically just said, you know, I don't think our troops act like Americans. They abuse the Vietnamese, they abuse prisoners. But again, there were no specifics in it, and virtually everybody answered of these dozen or so junior officers in I Corps up in the north, where this letter finally arrived, answered with the same thing, all just kind of nonsense, you know, don't know what this guy's talking about. We have great relationships with the Vietnamese, even though they all knew it wasn't true. But there were no specifics to respond to. It was a later letter, long after Powell had left there, that laid out the specifics of it. And in '95, when he was thinking of running for president, it was brought up as a criticism of him, I think unfairly. I think he behaved not with great honor or distinction, but certainly not in any way to be accused of being part of the cover-up, which had actually occurred long before Powell had actually even arrived in Vietnam during his second tour there. You know, in terms of the racial stuff, I found that so interesting that Powell's sort of early time in the military and what was going on in the military during that period. And as he rose up, there's no question that Ronald Reagan liked having a black man in his front office, as did Caspar Weinberger, as did George Bush. No question about it. But I think that Powell was willing to put up with that because he thought he was accomplishing something. Now, I think Belafonte's comments really angered him because he, you know, to Powell, policy, military, race are completely separate worlds. And if Belafonte wanted to criticize administration policy or criticize Powell's role in administration policy, that was fine with him. But he felt that Belafonte had really kind of mixed the two together in a way that was counterproductive, both in policy terms and in racial terms, and it made him very angry. It's interesting to me as I go around. I've done a lot of call-in shows on black radio and stuff, and it is true that African Americans seem to be the most angry people at Powell. I don't think there's any question about that. People who feel like he really, not for racial reasons necessarily, but for policy reasons, that he really betrayed people. Sorry.
You talk about the image question with Powell, and it's an important one. And also you mentioned the fact that the JCS was the peak of his career in many ways. At that time, his image included it was not exactly a Powell doctrine, but close to it, about exit strategy. In your interviews with him, did you ever raise the issue of why he had not pushed some consideration of an exit strategy in the period between the inaugural and 9/11?
An exit strategy for between, you mean between?
Why he didn't talk about the necessity in moving to Iraq of also having an exit strategy for a period beyond the strictly military venture and the longer run for nation building or any of the other aspirations reflected in Bush's rhetoric.
I think that he repeatedly in internal meetings, as General Franks came in with the new plan over the course of more than a year, saying, here's our invasion plan, and the numbers kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. he repeatedly said, I think we need more troops. He called General Franks on the phone several times saying, I don't think this is right. I think you need a lot more troops. I think, though, that he felt very constrained, not only because he got no response to that, but also was very conscious of the fact that he was not the Secretary of Defense. And in a very military sort of way, you know, he would say, look, when I was chairman, I used to hate it when these retired generals called me up and said they knew better than I did, you know, and I'm not going to do that. So even though he was pushing for a different kind of strategy and certainly a different troop configuration, he thought it was absurd to do the kind of invading from Turkey point of view, and that all of those troops should have been sent around to the Persian Gulf. He did not push it. As he says, he didn't fall on his sword over it. He said his piece, and then he shut up. You know, in retrospect, should he have made more noise? I really don't think he was capable of doing that. I think he felt like he had done his duty by saying it. In terms of the post-war plan, you know, Powell is, as I say, he is a creature of institutions. Standard military doctrine called for the military to be there for post-conflict operations for a certain period of time to establish stability and then to withdraw. So to him, when Bush signed the order in January of '03 giving the Pentagon control over the post-war period, many people in the State Department were not happy about that. Powell told them to get over it. His idea was that they would do what they did in Afghanistan. They would turn it over to the United Nations. The United Nations would move in, would organize local leaders, and would establish a government. I think that it simply never occurred to him at that point that what was going to happen, that what happened was going to happen. He felt that the military would be there for a few weeks. I think he bought in to the greeted as liberators with flowers. And there also was so much enmity by that time between the Pentagon and the State Department that there was very definitely a feeling in the State Department, okay, you know, Don Rumsfeld, you wanted it, you got it. You know, let it fall apart, and then you'll see how wrong you are. I mean, which obviously is very unhealthy in policy terms, but I think that it really existed.
You realize that he blamed Secretary Powell for a lack of imagination. You're simply saying that he obeyed orders. Is an institutional loyalist to the tips of his fingers and thought that policy should be directed substantively military towards one side of the Potomac and possibly diplomacy on the other side of the Potomac. He found himself on the wrong side, but he might have imagined at an earlier stage consequences because of his experience and because he had so regularly talked about the need for an end game, an exit strategy, and yet didn't push the matter.
I think that's a fair statement.
I know we've got possible questions, and I apologize for those of you who didn't get in, but I feel some obligation to our guests to give her a little sustenance since she's been on the road since very early this morning. So if you'll join me once again, thank you.
Thank you very much.